Most beekeepers open their hives searching for visible proof of brood failure, scattered cappings, sunken cells, larvae the wrong color. But the colony had already been signaling distress 10 to 14 days before any of that became visible. The signal came from the nurse bees, and most beekeepers walked right past it. Have you experienced a brood failure that seemed to appear without warning? Leave a comment below. You may have seen this signal without recognizing what it meant. The nurse bee population is the invisible infrastructure of every hive. Not the queen, not the foragers, not the honey stores, the nurses. They feed larvae with a precision that no other organism in agriculture can match, every 30 to 60 seconds for the youngest brood, continuously, around the clock. When that feeding rate drops even slightly, larval development is compromised before a single visible symptom appears. If this kind of biology-first approach to beekeeping is what you're looking for, a like on this video helps this content reach more beekeepers who think the same way. Early American apiculturists understood something that modern inspection culture has largely set aside. Lorenzo Lorraine Langstroth, writing in the mid-19th century, described nurse bee behavior in terms that went beyond simple head count. He observed that nurses in a declining colony behave differently, that they cluster more loosely over the brood, that their inspection frequency changes, that the hive's internal temperature fluctuates in ways that competent colonies do not allow. These were not casual observations. They were the product of sustained, methodical watching. What most modern inspection guides focus on instead is the brood itself. The frames get checked, the larvae get examined, the cappings get pressed. But the nurses performing the work that keeps those larvae alive, their behavior, their density, their ratio to the brood they cover, go largely unobserved. What most beekeepers misunderstand is this: brood survival does not collapse. It erodes, slowly, invisibly, across a 10 to 14-day window, during which the colony is sending behavioral signals that precede any visible evidence of failure. To understand the nurse bee signal, it is necessary to understand the biology of larval feeding with some precision. A honeybee larva in its first 3 days of life, the critical pre-capping window, requires feeding at intervals the colony must sustain without interruption. Research building on the observational work of early apiculturists has established that young larvae are inspected and fed at intervals as short as every 30 seconds by active nurse bees. The nutritional quality of that feeding, the ratio of royal jelly components, the protein content, the moisture balance, determines whether a larva develops into a viable adult worker. This feeding rate is not automatic. It is a function of the nurse-to-brood ratio within the colony. When a sufficient number of nurse bees are present, relative to the amount of open brood, the feeding rate stays within the biological threshold that supports normal development. When that ratio deteriorates, when the brood area expands faster than the nurse population can support, or when nurse numbers drop due to loss, disease, or demographic lag, the feeding rate falls below that threshold. The larvae do not immediately show this. Their cells look normal. Their color may remain acceptable. Their position in the cell may appear unremarkable. But internally, their development has already been compromised. 10 to 14 days later, when those larvae fail to cap normally, or emerge underweight, or show elevated rejection rates, the inspection frame tells a story of failure. It does not tell the story of why. Strong colony, compromised brood, the cause, invisible 2 weeks prior. The earliest American beekeeping literature returned repeatedly to the concept of nurse bee sufficiency as a prerequisite for productive colonies. Moses Quinby, writing in the 1860s, warned against the temptation to expand brood chambers ahead of the colony's capacity to cover them. His framing was practical rather than biological. He observed that colonies whose brood expanded beyond their nurse population consistently underperformed, but the mechanism he was describing is precisely the nurse-to-brood ratio threshold. Charles Dadant, in subsequent decades, extended this observation in the context of spring buildup. He noted that colonies allowed to expand brood too rapidly in early spring frequently produced disappointing summer populations, and that the cause was not disease but insufficiency, too much brood for the available nursing population to maintain at the biological threshold necessary for full development. These were not theories. These were recorded outcomes from sustained observation of colony performance across multiple seasons. The pattern was consistent enough that experienced apiculturists built management decisions around it. If you value biology-based beekeeping, consider subscribing. The nurse bee signal, as described in the historical record and supported by subsequent understanding of colony biology, is not a single visible marker. It is a cluster of behavioral patterns that appear before brood symptoms emerge. The first indicator is nurse bee density over the open brood. In a colony with an adequate nurse-to-brood ratio, Nurses cover the open brood frames consistently. They move across the comb with focused inspection behavior, pausing at cells, dipping their heads to examine larvae, feeding and moving on. The coverage is dense and purposeful. In a colony approaching a nurse insufficiency, the coverage becomes thinner. Nurses are still present, still working, but the gaps between them over the open brood become visible. The brood surface is not fully covered. The second indicator is clustering behavior at the brood margins. In a well-nursed colony, the boundary between capped brood and open brood is a zone of intense nurse activity. In a colony approaching insufficiency, this margin activity diminishes. Nurses retreat slightly toward the center of the brood nest rather than maintaining the edge. The perimeter of the brood area becomes quieter, less attended, less purposeful in appearance. The third indicator, more difficult to observe but historically documented, is brood nest cluster cohesion across variable ambient temperatures. Langstroth noted that a healthy colony maintains its brood nest within a narrow temperature range, 93 to 96 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of modest swings in outside conditions. Early apiculturists learned to assess this indirectly, not with instruments but through observation of how consistently the cluster held its shape during inspection and how quickly it reconsolidated when disturbed. A colony whose nurses are stretched thin over too much brood shows subtle inconsistencies in this behavior. Thin coverage, retreating margin behavior, inconsistent cluster cohesion. These three signals appearing together precede visible brood failure by 10 to 14 days. Here is where the timing becomes critical, and here is where many well-intentioned management decisions make the situation worse. The 10 to 14-day window between the nurse bee signal and visible brood failure aligns almost exactly with the most common spring inspection interval. A beekeeper who opens a hive every 2 weeks during spring buildup is likely to inspect once before the signal fully manifests and once after visible damage has appeared, missing the intervention window entirely. More bees, less time to act. The biological clock does not wait for the inspection schedule. The historical record offers a consistent management response to observed nurse insufficiency, and it is simpler than most modern approaches suggest. The first response is restraint in brood chamber expansion. When nurse bee coverage over open brood is visibly thin, adding space, whether a new super, an additional brood box, or supplemental drawn comb, accelerates the problem rather than solving it. The colony's brood area is already exceeding its nursing capacity. More space invites more brood at the expense of the nurses already insufficient to support what exists. If this breakdown was useful, leave a comment with your experience. Subscribe for more historically grounded beekeeping insights. Dadant's records suggest that competent apiculturists of his era would temporarily close down brood space when nurse coverage appeared inadequate, reducing the available laying area by removing or exchanging frames rather than adding to it. This is counterintuitive in a spring management context where the instinct is to give the colony room. But the biology is clear. The colony needs nurses sufficient for the brood it already has before it can safely expand. The second response, documented in the Langstroth tradition, involves the addition of nurse bees directly, not packages, not splits from distant colonies, but frames of emerging brood from colonies whose nurse populations are demonstrably adequate. The key is emerging brood, not open larvae, and not capped cells still days from emergence. Emerging brood adds nurse-age bees to the receiving colony within 24 to 48 hours of the frame transfer, without introducing the demographic disruption of forager-age bees from an outside source. The timing of this transfer matters precisely. Frames should come from a donor colony where nurse coverage is visibly dense and brood nest temperature appears stable. Transferring frames from a colony also showing nurse insufficiency redistributes the problem rather than resolving it. 1 to 2 frames of emerging brood transferred within the observation window can stabilize the nurse-to-brood ratio before visible brood damage occurs. This is not a dramatic intervention. It is a small, timed correction applied at the right biological moment. The third response is a temporary reduction in the rate at which the brood nest expands, achieved not through queen manipulation, but through brood nest constriction. Placing a honey or pollen frame adjacent to the brood nest on each side slows the queen's lateral expansion without removing her from the colony. The nurses can consolidate their attention on a reduced brood area while their numbers recover. This approach requires no additional equipment and no disruption to the queen's continuity. It requires only the willingness to work within the colony's actual capacity rather than ahead of it. These three approaches, restraint in expansion, addition of emerging brood, and temporary brood nest constriction, were available to every apiculturist in the historical record. They remain available today. The most common mistake at this stage is treating the symptom rather than the cause. When spotty brood appears 2 weeks after the nurse bee signal passed unnoticed, the instinct is to look for disease, varroa pressure, chalk brood, European foul brood. These are legitimate concerns and should never be dismissed. But an overlay of diagnostic attention focused on pathogen identification can delay recognition of a simpler underlying cause. The colony ran short of nurses before the brood did. Not every spotty pattern is disease. Some of it is nursing insufficiency that a timed frame transfer could have prevented. What does a successful intervention look like? Not a dramatic reversal, not a suddenly booming colony. A colony that receives timely nurse bee support in the 10 to 14-day window before visible brood failure shows stabilized capping rates in the subsequent inspection cycle. Brood pattern improves gradually over the following 10 to 21 days as the nurse-to-brood ratio recovers. The colony's forager population 3 to 4 weeks later reflects the larvae that survived the corrected nursing window. Workers that develop fully and enter the forager pool on the biological schedule the colony needs for the main nectar flow. The loss that is prevented is quiet. It does not register as a dramatic recovery. It registers as a colony that performs consistently through the transition from spring buildup to summer foraging, rather than one that falls short in forager numbers at the moment the flow demands them most. Stabilized surplus, prevented avoidable loss, restored foraging timeline. The nurse bee signal has always been there. It appeared in the hives of Quinby and Dadant and Langstroth before it appeared in any modern apiary. The beekeepers who learned to see it were not working with better equipment or superior genetics. They were working with sustained attention to behavior that precedes outcome. The bees have not changed. The signal has not changed. The inspection culture that passes over it that has changed. Opening a hive with attention to nurse density over open brood, to margin behavior at the brood nest edge, to the coherence of nursing coverage before any larva shows distress. This is not a new technique. It is an old observation applied with the consistency that early apiculture demanded and that careful beekeeping still requires. If this breakdown was useful, leave a comment with your experience. Subscribe for more historically grounded beekeeping insights.